explanations of forgetting. So you need to be aware about interference theory, and in particular proactive and retroactive interference, and be aware of retrieval failure due to an absence of cues. So what is interference? Interference is what happens when one piece of information conflicts with another piece of information, resulting in one or both of those getting distorted or altered. Now, there are two types that you need to be aware of. Proactive is when the older memory affects a new one, and retroactive is when a newer memory affects an old one. Now, to try and help you remember this, I always sort of think about retro is old, and it's named after the memory it is affecting. So retro affects old, so new affects old. Old affects new. Interference theory is more likely to happen, or is ever more severe, when the memories or information are quite similar. So if we look at a key piece of research for that, we have Magosh and McDonald's study. So participants were asked to learn a list of words where they could recall them 100% accurately. They were then given another new list of words to learn, and there were 6 conditions. Either they had synonyms, so words that meant the same thing, antonyms, words that had opposite meanings, unrelated words, so words that weren't related to the original list in any way, nonsense syllable, a 3-digit number, or no new list. Those were the control group. And it was found that the most similar material, so synonyms, produced the worst recall. So when participants were given very different materials, such as digits or nonsense syllables, then there was no interference. So it shows that interference was stronger when memories are more similar, and this is a type of retroactive interference. So as you see, the new material of the new list of words interfered with the ability to recall the original list of words. So new affecting old, retroactive interference. So if we move on to evaluating, now this is an explanation, so we're going to look at Scout again. So we have supporting research for Baddeley and Hitch. Now they asked rugby players to recall the names of the teams that they had played in a season, week by week. Now some members of the team had been out due to injury and hadn't played as many games, and it showed that accurate recall actually depended on the number of games that they had played in the meantime. So it wasn't the length of time that they had between the last game, it was the number of games that they played in between that made the difference. So that is a type of interference. The ability to recall the names of the teams that they had played depended on whether there had been interference with the number of teams that they had played. We've got some contradictory evidence. So it's found that memory was tested again after 24 hours. Recognition of that material seemed to have recovered, whereas recall remained the same. So there's a problem with recognition and recall. Also, it only seems to explain certain types of forgetting. So critics have argued that interference might happen in everyday life. It doesn't happen that often, and it is in very certain situations where the information needs to be really quite similar that it will happen. So it's not really a full explanation that would explain forgetting in everyday life. It only happens specifically when information is extremely similar. If we move on to testability then, most of the research has been done in lab situations and have used artificial lists of words or nonsense syllables. So if you think back to the original study that we talked about, they either had to learn a list of words, synonyms, antonyms, unrelated words, nonsense syllables, 3-digit numbers. Now that is quite artificial. It lacks mundane realism. It's not a task that you would do necessarily in everyday life. So we should be cautious when generalising and when applying those findings to forgetting in everyday life. So it might not be actually that accurate. it lacks ecological validity, lacks mundane realism. So is it as accurate an explanation as it could be? However, obviously the benefits of doing a lab-based study is that we have that strict control over the environment. So it is likely that we are testing retroactive interference, or Magoshi MacDonald were testing retroactive interference and the effects of similarity on it, because they were able to control all other extraneous variables that could have confounded the results. So that meant that the study does have high internal validity, and it is high in reliability due to the standardised procedures. However, we do need to be cautious with this external validity and everyday life due to the artificial nature of the tasks. So if we were to look at some exam questions then, there hasn't been that many come up in the past. So this is an example. We've got a series of questions that seem to link together. So in the context of explanations for forgetting, what is meant by interference? 2 marks. Now that is not a massive amount that you have to write. So think about 2 key points that you're going to mention to this. So it could be that forgetting happens in long-term memory because we can't get any memories even though they are available. So it's when 2 pieces of information are in conflict with one another. You might want to mention in there that this interference is worse when the memories or information is similar. Moving on to part B, choose one study in which the effects of interference was investigated. Briefly outline what the participants had to do in the study. So now this is the key part of reading the question. So briefly outline, I'm going to describe, but not in lots of detail, what participants had to do. So you're not going to tell me the aims of the study, you're not going to tell me the conclusions or the findings. I just want to know in this what participants were asked to do in the study. So we talk about participants were given a list of words to learn, and once they had the ability to recall that list of words accurately, they were then given a new list of words to learn. 1 of 6 conditions, you can mention some of the conditions, so synonyms, antonyms, nonsense syllables, unrelated words, etc. So just the procedure. Don't tell me anything that isn't needed there. The temptation is to discuss everything you know about that piece of research. Please do not do so. You won't get any extra marks for it, and you will waste valuable time that you need for the extended questions or the essay questions that might come up. Briefly discuss one limitation of interference as an explanation of forgetting. Now this is where you need to make sure you have both strengths and weaknesses of a theory or explanation, because they can be quite specific in their what type of evaluation point they want to give you. So this is one limitation. They might also be specific in saying explain 2 weaknesses of this theory or explain 2 strengths. So it's important to make sure that you do try and know, or you do have at least 2 evaluation points, either in terms of strengths and weaknesses for a theory, if you are able to do so. So one limitation of interference as an explanation for forgetting. So you might want to talk about the artificial nature of the tasks, that it doesn't explain forgetting in everyday life due to only certain types of forgetting due to the highly similar the material needs to be in the first place, etc, etc. Because it is 3 marks, I would try to make sure that you point, evidence, explain the evaluation point as a minimum. If you can do a linked sentence, then please try to do so. It helps you remain focused to that question. So moving on to retrieval failure then. Retrieval failure is meant to occur in a long-term memory because we do not have cues or hooks to help us access that memory. So it's not that the memory isn't available or the information isn't available, it's that it is our ability to access that memory that is the problem. So generally, a memory is associated with a cue, and if that cue is present at the time that we had encoded the information and at the time that we are being asked to recall the information, then our retrieval rate should be greater. So this is the encoding specificity principle, so ESP. So we should have the same cues present at encoding and recall. Now there's two types that are important. We have context dependent cues, so they are ones that are linked to the context in which you learnt the information, so the environment that you learnt the information, so the room you were in, etc. And state dependent, which are linked to the emotional state that you were in when you learnt the information, so the mood or how you were feeling when you learnt or encoded that information. Cues are helpful because they allow us to link material in a meaningful way. So it allows us to act as a hook to get that information. So if we were to look at a case study for this, you might want to talk about Godden and Badley's scuba diver study. So this was context dependent forgetting. So 18 scuba divers had to learn a list of words either on land or underwater. They then had to recall the words that they had learned either on land or underwater. This resulted in 4 experimental conditions. So either they learnt the words on land and recalled the words on land. They learnt the words on land or recalled the words underwater. They learnt the words underwater and recalled on underwater, or they learnt the words underwater and recalled on land. So there were 2 conditions in which the context in which they learnt and recalled were the same. So recalled on land, learnt on land and recalled on land, or learnt underwater and recalled underwater. And it was found that when those environmental contexts were the same, accurate recall was greater. So recall was 40% lower in the conditions that didn't match. This led them to conclude that external cues are important in the ability to retrieve information. So context is important, and retrieval failure happens when there is an absence of those environmental cues. So if we look at SCOUT, or our acronym, to try and help us with the ability to retrieve the evaluation points for this, we have supporting evidence by Isaac that says that retrieval failure is probably the most common reason for forgetting in long-term memory. So it's that inability to access information due to the cue of either context or state not being present. We have some conflicting evidence. So Godden and Badley replicated their original study, and this time they did a test of recognition rather than a test of recall. So they had to say whether they recognised the word rather than recalling the words. So they had to identify which words they had learnt rather than having free recall. And it was found that there was no context dependent forgetting. So it only seems to explain information when you have to recall it rather than recognition of information. Badley went on to argue that context effects are not actually very strong, especially in real life situations. He argues that the environmental contexts have to be very, very different in order for an effect to be seen. So for instance, Godden and Badley's research of you learn on land but recall underwater, those contexts are extremely different. Now it's unlikely that learning information, say in your psychology classroom, and then being tested in your geography classroom is going to make that much of a difference. They're still classrooms, they're still quite similar situations. The only effect would be is when those 2 environmental contexts are extremely different. So it doesn't really explain real life forgetting. It is extremely useful though. So research has shown that even just picturing the room in which you learnt the material is enough of a cue to help you retrieve the information. This is beneficial for exam techniques or revision aids, so to try and get students to imagine the room, how you are feeling in terms of state dependent and context dependent. It might be enough to get a bit more information. Also, the police have developed the cognitive interview, and one of those components of the cognitive interview is to reinstate context. So witnesses will be asked to take themselves back to visually to the place where they'd witnessed the crime, how they felt, what the day was like, what were they wearing, what was going on around them. So they're trying to reinstate the context, put them back into the context of when they encoded that information, to act as a cue to help them retrieve the information. So this has been highly useful for research. When we look at the cognitive interview, we will see that it's a lot more effective than the standard interview. So this shows the benefits of doing psychological research for society and how it can impact on the economy, how it can impact on the justice system and the police system. Testability, though, there are issues with ESP. So some argue that it is not testable and leads to circular reasoning. So what that means is that in experiments where researchers manipulate the cues in order to test recall, if a participant was able to recall the words that they learnt, they assume that that cue must have been encoded at the same time that they learnt that information. Equally, if they failed to successfully recall the information, it would argue that the cue isn't present, or the cue that was present at the time of encoding isn't present at the time of recall. So this leads to a circular reasoning, and it's very hard to actually test scientifically. So you should be cautious when looking at the findings from, say, Godden and Badley's research and the research that tested state-dependent forgetting. So that was where participants were given antihistamines or not, and had to learn a list of words. So if we were to look at a extended essay question that has been asked in the past, this is an application question, so it's not a standard typical AO1, AO3 essay-based question. It's AO1, AO2 and AO3, so you can get marks for application. So if we were to read the stem, Martin is studying for his modern language exams. He revises French followed by Spanish on the same night and gets confused between the two. For example, he remembers the French word for chair instead of the Spanish word for chair. Sometimes his mum helps Martin's vocabulary. When he is unable to remember the word, she tells him the first letter, then he can often recall it correctly. Now the question is, discuss two explanations of forgetting. Refer to Martin's experience in your answer. So remember, the command word discuss means outline and evaluate. So you're going to have to give me your AO1. You're going to have to describe the two explanations of forgetting. This is where it's important to understand the bullet points of the specification. So you should see two explanations of forgetting. You should know those two are interference theory and retrieval failure. So you're like, okay, I need to have one paragraph on interference theory. I'm going to need another paragraph on retrieval failure. Refer to Martin's experience in your answer. Okay, so now I'm going to have to relate both of those explanations to the scenario above. Now, in order to do this, what I would personally do is I would have separate paragraphs on your description and your application to make it crystal clear to the examiner that you have gone, here's my outline. I am meeting assessment objective 1, my knowledge and understanding. Here is my application to Martin's scenario. I am meeting assessment objective 2. I am applying my knowledge to this new situation. So I'd have them as two distinct paragraphs. So I'd describe interference theory as when information interferes with one or both memories, causing them to get distorted. I talk about proactive and retroactive interference, and I talk about how Similarity increases the likelihood of interference happening. So interference is worse when the two pieces of information are very similar. I would then relate it to Martin. So the fact that Martin revises French first, followed by Spanish. He remembers the French word for chair instead of the Spanish word for chair. So this is old information affecting new. That's an example of proactive interference. So I'd say in this situation, Martin is demonstrating proactive interference because, and then I would lift key words or quotes from the scenario to make explicit reference. So for instance, he learned French followed by Spanish. He then remembers the French word for chair instead of the Spanish word for chair. This demonstrates his old information affecting new. Also, you would mention that because they are both languages, they are very similar, therefore interference is greater. I would then evaluate this theory. So I'd do my AO3, maybe 2 evaluation points. You could try and do a balance, so have a strength and a weakness. I would then move on to my AO1 of retrieval failure. So I'll say about cues need to be present in order to help us access information. If there is an absence of cues, we are more likely to forget or unable to access the information that we have stored. You might want to talk about state dependent and context dependent forgetting. Then I would move on to my AO2 paragraph, my separate paragraph about Martin, and I'd say that his mum gives him the first letter. Now this acts as a cue for Martin and it helps him retrieve the information and access the information so he can recall it. I would then talk about strengths and weaknesses of retrieval failure as an explanation of forgetting.